The afternoon sun beat down on Interstate 40 as the Brennan family's station wagon rolled steadily westward through New Mexico. It was July 1989, and David Brennan had promised his wife Linda and their two daughters, 12-year-old Jessica and 8-year-old Amy, that this road trip would be the adventure of a lifetime. They'd left their home in Tulsa 3 days earlier, bound for the Grand Canyon with stops at every quirky roadside attraction along the way. The girls sang along to the radio in the back seat, their voices competing with the rush of hot wind through the partially open windows. "Dad, I need to use the bathroom," Amy announced, tugging at her seatbelt. David glanced at the fuel gauge, which hovered just above a quarter tank. "We'll stop at the next town. Should be coming up in about 15 miles according to the map." Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Now let's get back to the Brennans. The town of Painted Rock appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering in the heat. Population 847, according to the weathered sign at the town limits. David pulled into a combination gas station and diner, the only business that looked open on the sleepy main street. While Linda took the girls to the restroom, David began filling the tank, exchanging pleasantries with the attendant, an older man named Frank who'd lived in Painted Rock his entire life. "You folks just passing through?" Frank asked, squinting against the sun. "Headed to the Grand Canyon," David replied. "The girls have never seen it. Beautiful drive ahead. You'll want to take Highway 89 when you get past Flagstaff. More scenic than staying on the interstate." Linda emerged from the diner with the girls, each clutching a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. "They had the cleanest restroom I've seen on this entire trip," she said with a smile. David paid for the gas, and they were back on the road within 20 minutes. Jessica had picked up a brochure inside advertising a desert botanical garden just 30 miles ahead. "Can we stop, Dad? Please? It says they have the largest saguaro cactus in the state." David exchanged a glance with Linda, who shrugged with an indulgent smile. "Why not? We're not in any rush." That decision, that simple detour to see a giant cactus, would alter the course of their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. The botanical garden sat at the end of a poorly maintained county road that wound through increasingly barren landscape. David's confidence in the brochure's directions wavered as the pavement gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt. The station wagon kicked up clouds of reddish dust that hung in the still air behind them. "Are you sure this is right?" Linda asked, her earlier enthusiasm replaced by concern. "We haven't seen another car in miles." "The brochure said it was off the beaten path," David said, though his grip on the steering wheel had tightened. "Authentic desert experience and all that." They'd traveled nearly 8 miles down the deteriorating road when the car began to sputter. David's heart sank as the engine coughed, the power steering suddenly becoming heavy in his hands. He managed to guide the vehicle to the side of the road before it died completely. "What happened?" Jessica asked from the back seat, her voice thin with worry. David turned the key. The starter clicked, but the engine refused to catch. He tried again with the same result. "I don't know, sweetheart. Let me take a look." The heat outside the car was oppressive, the sun turning the metal hood almost too hot to touch even through the rag David used. He knew enough about cars to check the basics. Oil level looked fine, battery connections were secure, but he was no mechanic. After 15 frustrating minutes, he had to admit defeat. "We're going to have to walk back to that gas station," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Frank seemed like a helpful guy. "Maybe he knows someone who can tow us." Linda looked down the long stretch of empty road they'd traveled. "That's got to be 8 or 9 miles, David. In this heat, with the girls." "We don't have much choice. We passed a house about 3 miles back. Maybe we can use their phone." They gathered what they could carry: water bottles, a few snacks, hats to shield them from the sun. David locked the car, though the gesture seemed absurd in such isolation. The walk back began with the girls treating it like an adventure, but within the first mile, the reality of the heat and distance began to wear on everyone. The house David remembered materialized as they rounded a bend in the road. It was a small, weathered structure, set back from the road, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had seen better days. A pickup truck sat in the driveway, its paint faded by years of sun exposure. As they approached, a woman emerged onto the porch, watching them with an expression David couldn't quite read. "Car trouble?" she called out as they neared the gate. "Engine died on us," David replied, relieved to see another human being. "I don't suppose you have a phone we could use? We need to call for a tow." The woman, who introduced herself as Diane Fletcher, invited them inside, where a swamp cooler struggled against the heat. She was perhaps 40, with sun-weathered skin and suspicious eyes that lingered on Linda and the girls. Her husband, she explained, worked in Albuquerque during the week and wouldn't be home until Friday. "Phone's in the kitchen," Diane said, gesturing down a narrow hallway. David made the call to the gas station in Painted Rock. Frank answered and promised to send his nephew Bobby with the tow truck, but it would be at least 2 hours before he could get there. The truck was currently towing a broke-down semi on the other side of the county. 2 hours, David repeated, when he returned to the living room where Linda and the girls sat perched awkwardly on a worn couch. "He says we should wait with the car so Bobby can find us." Diane offered them more water and some crackers, which they accepted gratefully. The conversation was stilted, Diane asking questions that felt invasive. Where exactly were they from? Where were they staying? Did anyone know their route? Linda's discomfort grew with each inquiry, and she caught David's eye with a meaningful look. "We should probably start walking back," Linda said, standing. "We don't want to miss the tow truck." "You'll roast out there," Diane said. "At least wait another hour until the sun's lower." But Linda was already ushering the girls toward the door, thanking Diane for her hospitality with a forced smile. David followed, confused by his wife's sudden urgency, but trusting her instinct. They were half a mile down the road when Jessica said what they'd all been thinking. She was weird, wasn't she? "Just a lonely woman in the middle of nowhere," David said, though he'd felt it too. Something off about Diane Fletcher, about the way her eyes had followed Amy in particular. The tow truck found them 45 minutes later, Bobby Fletcher driving at a pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry. He was Diane's nephew, he explained, and mentioned that his aunt had called to report which direction they'd headed. The car was exactly where they'd left it, and Bobby had it hooked up and ready to tow within 20 minutes. "Fuel pumps shot," Bobby declared after a quick look under the hood. "I can get you a replacement, but it won't be until tomorrow morning. Parts store in Gallup won't be open until then." David's heart sank. Their carefully planned itinerary was falling apart. "Is there a motel in Painted Rock?" "Just the Sunset Inn. Clean enough. Mrs. Patterson runs it. Tell her I sent you and she'll give you the weekly rate for one night." The Sunset Inn was exactly what its name suggested. A small motor lodge with 8 units, each painted a fading shade of turquoise. Mrs. Patterson was a grandmother type who clucked sympathetically over their misfortune and gave them the room at the far end, away from the highway noise. It had 2 double beds, a small television, and air conditioning that actually worked. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in front of some sitcom rerun, Linda whispered to David in the darkness. There was something wrong with that woman. Diane, the way she looked at the girls, the questions she asked. "I've never felt anything like that before." "You think we should report it to someone?" David asked. "Report what?" "That she made me uncomfortable. We're leaving tomorrow anyway." But Linda couldn't shake the feeling, and she made David promise to check that the door was locked twice before she could settle into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Bobby arrived at the motel with the repaired car by 10 o'clock. David paid the bill, generous with the tip, because Bobby had worked on it first thing. They were back on the road by 11, and painted rock disappeared in the rearview mirror. Linda seemed to relax with every mile they put between themselves and that isolated house, and by the time they reached Flagstaff, the incident had faded into just another odd moment from a road trip. They spent 4 glorious days at the Grand Canyon, returned home to Tulsa, and life resumed its normal rhythm. David went back to his job at the aerospace plant. Linda continued teaching 3rd grade. The girls started school that fall. The broken-down car in New Mexico became a family story, retold with humor at Thanksgiving dinner. But 21 years later, in July 2010, Linda received a phone call that brought everything crashing back. The woman on the other end identified herself as Detective Sharon Willis from the New Mexico State Police. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm calling about an incident that may have involved your family in July of 1989. You took a road trip through New Mexico that summer?" Linda's mouth went dry. "Yes. Our car broke down near a town called Painted Rock." "Why? What is this about?" "We've recently made an arrest in connection with a series of child abductions that occurred in the Southwest between 1987 and 1993. The suspect has been identified as Diane Fletcher. During the investigation of her property, we found detailed notebooks containing descriptions of potential victims, including your daughters." The room spun. Linda gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, forcing herself to breathe. "Our daughters!" But nothing happened. We were only in that house for maybe 30 minutes. "Mrs. Brennan, you and your family were extremely lucky. Diane Fletcher and her husband operated what we believe was a trafficking network. They specifically targeted families traveling through remote areas. The notebooks we recovered contain entries about your family, physical descriptions of your daughters, your license plate number, information about where you were headed. There's an entry dated the day after your encounter that suggests they had been planning to follow you but were unable to locate your vehicle." Linda couldn't speak. In the background, she could hear Detective Willis continuing, but the words seemed to come from very far away. "The reason I'm calling now is because we're building a case, and we need to establish a timeline. According to our investigation, Diane Fletcher took someone to a hospital in Gallup on July 23, 1989, 2 days after your encounter with her. The intake record shows she brought in a girl she claimed was her niece who had fallen and hit her head. The hospital staff noted inconsistencies in her story, but this was before mandatory reporting systems were as robust as they are now. The girl disappeared from the hospital before social services could be contacted, and no one reported her missing." "I don't understand," Linda managed. "What does this have to do with us?" "We believe the girl at the hospital was one of Fletcher's victims. We're trying to establish exactly when she was taken and from where. Your family's encounter helps us tie down the timeline. It proves Fletcher was actively looking for victims during that specific week. It also explains why she suddenly had a child to pass off as her niece 2 days later. She'd identified your daughters, but couldn't act on it, so she found another target." The detective continued explaining the investigation, but Linda had stopped listening. She was back in that sweltering living room, watching Diane Fletcher's eyes follow Amy around the cramped space. She was remembering the relief she'd felt when they'd left, the instinct that had screamed at her to get her children out of that house. After the call ended, Linda sat at the kitchen table for an hour before she could bring herself to call David at work. That evening they sat Jessica and Amy down, both grown women now, Jessica married with a baby of her own, Amy finishing graduate school, and told them what the detective had revealed. "I don't remember much about that day," Amy admitted. "I was so young, Just that it was hot and the lady had a weird smile, but Jessica remembered more. She asked me questions about school, about my friends. She wanted to know if we had family in Arizona, if anyone knew exactly where we were going to be staying. I thought she was just making conversation, but Mom, you pulled us out of there so fast. Your mother's instincts saved your lives, David said quietly. If we'd stayed there another hour, if we'd accepted her offer to drive us somewhere, if Bobby hadn't found us when he did. He couldn't finish the sentence. The trial began 6 months later. David and Linda flew to Albuquerque to testify about their encounter. Diane Fletcher sat in the courtroom, her face showing no emotion as witness after witness described the horrors found on her property. The notebooks Linda had been told about were entered as evidence, dozens of them spanning years, filled with observations about families, children, opportunities that had presented themselves or been missed. The entry about the Brennan family was read aloud. Family of 4, 2 girls, 12 and 8 approximately, Oklahoma plates, headed to Grand Canyon. Car trouble on CR 447. Window of opportunity 48 to 72 hours before arrival expected in Arizona. Follow-up unsuccessful. Vehicle not located at anticipated locations. Moved on. Moved on. As if they'd been nothing more than a business transaction that had fallen through. As if Jessica and Amy had been items on a shopping list. Another witness took the stand. A woman named Patricia Donovan, who'd been 9 years old in 1989 when she'd been abducted from a rest stop outside of Holbrook, Arizona. She'd been the girl Diane Fletcher had taken to the hospital in Gallup. Patricia described being held in a basement, the terror of those days, the confusion when Diane had dressed her in clean clothes and driven her to the hospital, coaching her on what to say. She told me if I said the wrong thing, she'd come back for my little brother, Patricia testified, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. So I said what she told me to say, that I'd fallen, that I'd gotten lost from my family, but I never saw my family again until I was 15. Patricia had been sold to a couple in Nevada who'd kept her for 6 years before she'd managed to escape. The couple had been arrested years earlier on unrelated charges, but Patricia had been too traumatized to speak about where she'd come from or how she'd ended up with them. It was only when Diane Fletcher's arrest made national news that Patricia had come forward, and investigators had been able to connect her testimony to the hospital records from 1989. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just the notebooks, but physical evidence recovered from the Fletcher property, testimony from survivors like Patricia, financial records showing large, unexplained cash deposits. Diane's husband, who died in 2003, had been the primary operator of the trafficking network, but Diane had been an active participant, scouting for victims and maintaining the detailed records that would ultimately lead to her conviction. She was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. As she was led from the courtroom, Diane Fletcher looked directly at Linda Brennan for the first time since the trial had begun. There was no remorse in her expression, just a cold calculation that made Linda's blood run cold. On the flight home, David held Linda's hand as she stared out the window at the southwest landscape passing below. "We were so lucky," she whispered. "That car breaking down where it did, when it did. If it had happened an hour later, we might have been too far down that road. If we'd stayed at her house—" "But we didn't," David said firmly. "You got us out of there. You felt something was wrong, and you acted on it." But Linda couldn't shake the weight of knowing how close they'd come, and she couldn't stop thinking about the other families who hadn't been as lucky, the children who'd been stolen from their parents because of a flat tire or a wrong turn or a moment of misplaced trust. 5 years after the trial, in 2015, Linda received another call from Detective Willis. "I wanted you to know that we've identified 3 more victims through the notebooks. Families who reported strange encounters in the area during those years, but never understood what they'd narrowly avoided. We're also working with several survivors who've come forward now that they know it's safe. Your testimony was crucial in making the case, and because of it, we've been able to bring closure to families who've spent decades wondering what happened to their children. Has anyone else been found? Linda asked, though she knew the answer would be painful regardless. 2 more survivors in addition to Patricia, the detective replied. Both women now, both recovering. But the notebooks reference at least 16 other children who we haven't been able to identify or locate. Some of those entries are so old, I'm not optimistic we'll find them. After the call ended, Linda sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd received that first call 5 years earlier, and thought about the randomness of it all. How a faulty fuel pump had placed her family in the path of a predator, how a mother's instinct and a timely tow truck had saved them, how other families hadn't been so fortunate, their lives shattered by the same kind of mechanical failure or navigational error that had nearly claimed Jessica and Amy. That evening, she pulled out the old photo album from that road trip. There was a picture of the girls standing in front of the Grand Canyon, their faces bright with joy and wonder. She studied their young faces, seeing echoes of the women they'd become, Jessica with her own children now, Amy working as a social worker helping trauma survivors. Neither of them had been destroyed by learning how close they'd come to a different fate, but Linda knew the knowledge had changed them, had made them both more cautious and more grateful. David found her there an hour later, tears running down her face as she turned the pages of memories. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I keep thinking about what Detective Willis said. 16 children they haven't found, 16 families still wondering. We got our happy ending, David. We got to watch our girls grow up. We got to see Jessica get married. We're going to be grandparents to more babies. We got all of that because our car broke down in one spot instead of another, because we left that house when we did. It's not fair that we were so lucky when others weren't." "Life isn't fair," David agreed quietly, "but we can honor those who weren't as fortunate. We can support organizations that help survivors. We can make sure Jessica and Amy understand how precious every moment is. We can tell this story so that other parents know to trust their instincts when something feels wrong." And they did. Linda began volunteering with a non-profit that supported families of missing children. She shared her story at conferences and support group meetings, talking about the importance of trusting gut feelings and the thin line between safety and disaster. Jessica joined her mother in this work after her own children were born, understanding in a way she couldn't have before how close she'd come to a different life. The family still took road trips. They refused to let fear win, but they approached travel differently now. They checked in regularly with friends and family. They researched their routes more carefully. They never ignored that small voice that whispered warnings when something didn't feel right. And every July, on the anniversary of that day in 1989, the Brennan family gathered together. They didn't dwell on what might have been, but they acknowledged it. They honored the 16 lost children whose names they didn't know, whose faces they'd never seen, whose lives had been cut short or forever altered because they'd been less lucky than 2 girls from Tulsa who'd simply needed to use a bathroom on a hot summer day. The story of their near miss spread beyond their family. A journalist wrote an article about it, framing it within the larger narrative of Diane Fletcher's crimes. Producers approached them about turning it into a documentary, but Linda declined. This wasn't entertainment. It was their lives, and more importantly, it was the lives of those who hadn't survived to tell their stories. But she did agree to speak at a conference for law enforcement officials working in crimes against children. Standing before an audience of detectives, FBI agents, and social workers, Linda described that day in detail. The heat, the isolation, the way Diane Fletcher had looked at her daughters, the feeling that had made her grab her children and leave. "The thing I want you to understand," Linda told them, "is that this woman looked normal. She seemed helpful. Her house was modest but clean. There were no obvious red flags except for a feeling I couldn't name. And I almost ignored that feeling because I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. How many other parents have done the same thing? How many have accepted help from someone who made them uncomfortable because they felt obligated or didn't trust their instincts?" After her speech, dozens of people approached her with their own stories, moments when they'd felt something was off but hadn't acted on it, or had acted on it, and later learned they'd narrowly avoided danger. The validation was powerful, but so was the grief for those whose instincts hadn't been enough, who'd been overpowered by circumstances or bad luck, or the simple randomness of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, in 2025, the Brennan family story has become part of the training materials used by organizations that work to prevent child trafficking. That photograph of Jessica and Amy at the Grand Canyon, taken just days after their near abduction, is used in presentations to illustrate how close danger can come without families even realizing it. Jessica's children, now teenagers themselves, know the story. They know how their mother might have never existed if a car had broken down 15 minutes later, or if their grandmother had prioritized politeness over instinct. They carry that knowledge with them, understanding that survival sometimes comes down to factors beyond anyone's control, and that every moment of their lives exists because of a series of small decisions and coincidences that aligned in their family's favor. Linda is 68 now, David's 71. They still take road trips, though they stick to major highways these days. They visited the Grand Canyon again for their 50th anniversary, retracing that route from 1989, but avoiding the detour that had nearly cost them everything. Standing at the rim, looking out over the vast canyon, Linda thought about the parallel lives that had almost been, the version where they'd stayed at Diane Fletcher's house just a little longer, where Bobby had taken another 30 minutes to find them, where any one of a dozen small variables had shifted slightly and created a completely different outcome. "Do you ever wonder about it?" Amy asked her mother during that anniversary trip. Amy had come along with her own family, wanting to see the place that had become such a significant part of their family mythology. About how different everything would have been. "Every day," Linda admitted, "but not in the way you might think. I don't wonder what if in a fearful way anymore. I wonder what if as a reminder that every moment we have together is a gift. That car breaking down was one of the worst experiences of my life while it was happening, but it led us to have all of this." She gestured at her daughters, her grandchildren, the beautiful landscape before them. All of this might not have existed if things had gone differently. So yes, I think about it, and I'm grateful. The Brennan family's story doesn't have the dramatic rescue that makes for good television. They weren't heroes who fought off their attacker or brilliant strategists who outwitted a predator. They were simply a family on vacation who got unlucky with a broken fuel pump and lucky with a mother's intuition and timing. Their escape wasn't the result of careful planning or extraordinary courage. It was the product of chance and instinct combining at the right moment. But perhaps that's what makes their story so powerful. It reminds us that survival isn't always about being the strongest or smartest. Sometimes it's about trusting feelings that can't be easily explained, about making decisions based on discomfort rather than concrete evidence, about the thin line between tragedy and normalcy. The last time Linda spoke to Detective Willis was in 2022, when the detective was retiring after 40 years in law enforcement. "Your family's case haunts me," Willis admitted. "Not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. I've worked hundreds of cases where families weren't so lucky, And I carry those with me, but I also carry your family's story as a reminder that sometimes the good guys win, even if it's just by accident. It wasn't entirely by accident, Linda replied. I made the choice to leave that house. I chose to trust my instincts over social convention. That choice mattered. You're right, Willis agreed. And I hope other parents are listening when you tell that story. I hope they give themselves permission to be rude, to leave situations that feel wrong, to prioritize their children's safety over a stranger's feelings. Because you're living proof that sometimes that's the difference between coming home and never being seen again. Today, the Brennan family continues to live ordinary lives marked by the extraordinary knowledge of what they survived. Jessica teaches her children to listen to their instincts. Amy works with survivors of trafficking, bringing the unique perspective of someone who almost became a victim herself. David and Linda have retired, spending their days with grandchildren who exist because a 29-year-old mother trusted a feeling she couldn't name. The house where Diane Fletcher lived has been torn down, the property sold and repurposed. The Sunset Inn, where the Brennans spent that night, closed years ago. Painted Rock continues to exist as a small dot on the map, most of its residents unaware of the darkness that once operated in their midst. And somewhere in storage, in boxes of evidence that will never be disposed of, sit Diane Fletcher's notebooks with their careful entries about families and opportunities and children who might have been taken if circumstances had been slightly different. The Brennan family's entry in those notebooks represents something most families never have to confront, tangible evidence of how close they came to losing everything. But it also represents something else, proof that mothers' instincts, chance timing, and simple decisions made in moments of discomfort can save lives. Their story serves as both a warning about dangers that hide in plain sight and a reminder that survival sometimes comes down to trusting yourself, even when you can't explain why. 21 years passed between that July day in 1989 and the phone call that revealed what the Brennans had narrowly escaped. 21 years of normal life, of graduations and weddings and grandchildren, built on a foundation of luck and instinct that they hadn't even known was there. And while Linda sometimes still wakes from dreams where she made different choices in Diane Fletcher's living room, she always opens her eyes to a reality where her daughters are safe, her family is intact, and that brief detour on a dusty New Mexico road led them not to tragedy, but to gratitude for every ordinary moment that followed.